Chapter 8. Jake Morton was a crabbed old man who lived alone on a small place across the valley from the Pages. His ranch wasn't much. He had only 6 sections under fence, and he ran less than 100 head of cattle on it. It was rich ranch land with proper supervision. Would have supported more than twice that many cows, but old man Morton was too lazy and too cantankerous to bother about trying to keep his ranch up. He was all alone in the world, and it provided for his simple needs, and he wasn't interested in anything else. He had a Mexican lad who worked for him and lived in a little shack down the creek from his house, and together the two of them managed to keep the ranch a-going. Above all else, Jake Morton resisted change and modernization. He resented all the modern improvements that his neighbors went in for, and loudly bewailed the passing of the good old days when there wasn't any fences to bother a man, and the acceptable way of building up a herd was to spread a wide loop and work fast with a hot running iron. The new fandangle ranching methods were ruining the country, he complained, and the breed of men and the cows were growing softer as each year went by. Jake laughed at Eustace Arlo when he first come to him with a proposal to lend him money to fix the ranch up and put in new stock. The ranch, it suited Jake as it was, and his gaunt, stingy white faces were the same as they had been raised his whole life, and were plenty good enough for him. He felt the same way about selling his ranch, even for a sum of money easily more than twice of what it was worth. He had lived on those 6 sections all his life, and by golly, he planned to die on them. He was comfortable in his little 2-room log house, and he reckoned he wouldn't be comfortable anywhere else in the world. He'd be darned if he'd be wanting to go traveling around the country on trains and such, and where would he go if he did sell out on the place? Arlo argued with the old man in vain and raised his price to almost double his original offer, but Jake Morton, he remained adamant.
"No, sirree," he exploded finally. "I ain't selling, and that's final."
He slammed a gnarled fist into his leathery palm and glared at the Texan.
"You must be crazy to want to buy it nohow. Anybody in the valley will tell you that my place ain't worth a damn."
"I'm not crazy," Arlo assured him with a thin smile. "Your 6 sections, they join up against the Simpson place, and I'm loaning him money to make improvements and expand. You're standing in the way of development, Mr. Morton." The old man snorted loudly.
"Leroy Simpson always was a danged fool. I reckon you're looking to foreclose on him and then add my 6 sections onto his place. I'll be dead first, I can tell you that."
"All right," said Arlo. "I'm in no hurry. I can just wait that long."
"I'm pretty tough," Morton told him seriously. "Good for a lot more years yet, I reckon."
Eustace Arlo replied, "Maybe," and then left it like that. Jake Morton was old and crabbed and set in his ways, but he was far from being a fool. He kept his mouth shut and his ears open and observed how Arlo was lending large sums of money to various ranchers throughout the valley at ridiculous low interest rates, and how the recipients were spending the money foolishly on things they didn't need, and he began to realize Arlo's plan to gain control of the entire valley. He didn't say anything about it to anyone. No one would have listened to him, and he didn't care what they did anyway. But he made his own private plans to circumvent Arlo. With no living relatives to leave his ranch to, he knew he'd be thrown on the open market in the event of his death, and he shrewdly suspected that Arlo was investigated and knew this as well. It was right after EZRA bought the Spangler place right out from under Arlo's nose that Morton got his grand idea. He liked EZRA, and he knew him, and he thought EZRA was too sensible to borrow money from the Texan or buckle down to him, so he made a trip to Pablo by stage one day and consulted a lawyer in the city. He had the lawyer draw up an iron-bound will that left his property to EZRA in the event of his death, and then he returned to Powder Valley, slyly elated at the way he'd fixed things so Arlo couldn't touch his 6 sections after he died. He didn't tell anyone in the valley what he had done, but settled back down on his ranch to keep on living just as he had before. One of the delights of Jake Morton's old age was the choke cherry wine he made each summer. There was a thick growth of brush along the creek running through his place, and every summer he gathered bushels of the red berries when they were ripe and hung them in thick clusters from the brush. He had 4 wooden barrels in which he made his wine by the process of his own, and he filled each barrel half full of ripe berries, throwing in twigs and leaves indiscriminately, and then put in enough creek water to cover the berries. A week later he stripped naked and washed himself in the creek, and then crawled inside each barrel and tromped out the juices, as he called this process. After that he threw a 50-pound sack of sugar in each barrel and filled it to the brim with water. He let 'em stand open until they quit working, and then drew the clear crimson liquid off into the kegs, which he set away for the winter. It was very potable, and strong enough so a man could get on a pretty fair drunk with 2 tin cups of her. Jake Morton always drank a cup before dinner, and then polished off 2 more before going to bed. He liked to sit by himself in the darkness before a flickering light of dry mesquite roots in the fireplace, and doze through the long evenings while he sipped his wine and got just drunk enough to stagger off to bed and go to sleep. For he didn't sleep well in those later years, and without his 2 tin cups of choke cherry wine, he was likely to lie awake and toss around till dawn. It was midnight, and Jake Morton was well along towards finishing his 2nd cup of wine, when he heard a horse riding up into the yard just outside his cabin. The old man was dozing along in a torrid state of relaxation. He wondered if the rider would be Simpson on his way back from some meeting in Dutch Springs. Simpson had stopped by on his way in earlier to urge Jake to ride in with them, but the old rancher refused. He wasn't interested in meetings, and he particularly wasn't interested when Simpson told him it was something cooked up by Eustace Arlo.
"I'll just sit right here in front of the fireplace and take her easy," Jake told Simpson. "I reckon you feel like you ought to ride in 'cause Harlow says so, huh? But me, I don't jump through a hoop for no man."
Simpson had flushed and angrily declared that he wasn't jumping through a hoop at Harlow's bidding neither, that he was simply attending the meeting because he believed it was a citizen's duty to take an interest in the community affairs. But old Jake just grunted sarcastically and poured himself another tin cup of wine and settled back to enjoy another long evening in his own ways. Now he cupped a hand behind his ears and listened to the sound of footsteps approaching the house. Didn't sound like Simpson's walk, he thought. His senses were dulled by wine, but he could tell pretty good that it wasn't his closest neighbor. This man was taking heavy, solid steps while Simpson sort of dragged along. Must be a stranger stopping by, Jake thought, for he hadn't any friends who would come to see him after midnight. He leaned forward and picked up a charred stick to stir the smoldering fire into bright flames, and then turned in his rawhide armchair to look at the man stepping inside his open door. The leaping flames showed a bulky figure with a red whiskered face and a disfigured scar down the one side of it. He appeared to have only one eye, and it was fixed upon the old rancher. Through his vision, it was blurred by drunkenness. Jake knew the man in the doorway must be Ezra, and he called out,
"Come on in, Ezra,"
impatiently, and then he saw the gun in the newcomer's hand. The muzzle swept up in a steady arc and covered him. Jake stared at it in disbelief and lifted one hand as though to ward off the impending danger. The 6-gun thundered and a bullet crashed into Jake Morton's chest. He collapsed in his rawhide chair with a groan, and the bulky figure disappeared from the doorway. A moment later there was a sound of galloping hooves, and they swiftly receded into the night. Jake Morton was still alive when Jose, the Mexican boy, came panting up from his shack a few minutes later. The rancher had strength enough to lift his head and gasp out,
Ezra shot me. Must be some mistake, I don't reckon."
His voice faded to nothingness, and then he died. Jose had noted the time when he heard the shot and jumped out of bed. It was easy to figure about what time Ethan Page had reached home from town, and the condition of his partially unclothed body indicated that he had been murdered before he had time to get into bed. That set the time of his death a little more than half an hour before Jake was killed. Just about time for a rider to gallop between the two ranches, and Jake's dying statement, coupled with Ethan Jr.'s description of his murdered parents, made things look pretty black for Ezra the next day, when people found out about Ezra's jailbreak and began putting two and two together. End of Chapter 8.